Kelly's book, Atlantis, the Lost Continent. This ancient civilization, talked about by Plato, has captivated the imagination. This includes this episode's guest, Andrew Collins. Hi, I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and welcome to Just Energy. Today's guest, Andrew Collins, is a popular writer of history, archaeology, and science. For over 30 years, he has explored the relationship between archaic regions, but beliefs, and the cosmos, examining the origins of human civilization and the development of technology and the inspirations of magic and religion. Andrew, thank you so much for coming back onto the show, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be with my viewers.
It's my pleasure.
And I look forward to delving into your new book, Atlantis in the Caribbean. I think it's an interesting theory that you're bringing forward, and because I think everyone is familiar with the concept of Atlantis. They've heard about Atlantis. But for those who aren't really familiar, they've heard of it, but don't really know the backstory on it. Maybe you can share a little about what we've learned, and I'm particularly interested in the Plato story because that seems to be the primary place where we've learned of Atlantis.
Indeed. Well, our main source for the Atlantis myth is Plato. He was a philosopher. He lived or wrote approximately around 350 BC. He wrote two dialogues, one called the Timaeus, another called the Critias. And what these are debates between historical characters from a few generations before his own time. And they discuss the matters of the day. In the Timaeus, for instance, the first of the two, they talk about science, astronomy, reality, the universe, things like this. And eventually they get onto a subject which seems to be of interest mutually amongst these debaters, and that's the matter of Atlantis. And essentially what is introduced at this point as part of this dialogue is the story of how there once existed in what Plato refers to as the Atlantic Sea, which is the section of the ocean river that surrounded the ancient world towards the west. It was called the Atlantic Sea because on the coast of Africa there was a huge mountain called Mount Atlas, which was said to be the likeness of the god Atlas holding the world on his back. And this would be the last thing that sailors would see on voyages deep into the ocean. So hence that's where the name comes from. And it was said that in ancient times, voyagers could travel from his world, in other words, the Mediterranean world, all the way across to what he refers to as the opposite continent. Now, he says that Atlantis was an island that linked this opposite continent, with the central area of the Atlantic, and that a series of other smaller islands linked Atlantis to this opposite continent. Now, he obviously goes on to describe Atlantis itself, but there's some very important facts that emerge simply from what I've said so far. Firstly, is that the opposite continent is quite clearly the Americas, because if you sail west from the African coast or from the Mediterranean, the only place you're going to eventually hit is either the American mainland or, of course, the islands of the Caribbean and the Bahamas. And so it was this that started to make me think that this was the rough area that Plato was telling us that Atlantis existed. But he also tells us that it was destroyed in one night of earthquakes and floods, because the Atlantean people had become too haughty. They'd become too big for their boots. They'd started to invade the coast of Europe. They'd even entered into the Mediterranean, he tells us, and because of which Zeus, the mighty sky god, decided that he would destroy the Atlanteans and so he creates this cataclysm to destroy them. Now, what Plato says is that the island of Atlantis then sank, and that in its place was this area of shallow water, these mud shoals, as he refers to them. And he said that these have remained hazardous to voyagers ever since, and that, in his words, they are no longer able to reach the opposite continent because of these very shallow waters. Again, some very important facts here. These mud shoals are something which a number of contemporary writers to Plato also talk about, but they add a vital piece of evidence as to the location of them, because they say that in the same vicinity are large areas of seaweed. Now, this seaweed is unquestionably what we know as the Sargasso Sea. Sargasso Sea is a massive area of seaweed that stretches from the mid-Atlantic all the way to the Bahamas. But beneath them there is no shallow waters, so clearly that's not where Atlantis is. However, just beyond the seaweed is the start of the Bahamas, and the Bahamas, as anybody will know who's ever been there, the waters are extremely shallow. They are, no more than 3 feet, 4 feet in some places. They go to a maximum depth of about 15 before you drop off on ledges down to much deeper channels, obviously, in certain parts of it. But they're notorious for their shallow waters. In fact, they're actually even called shoals. There are parts of the, for instance, off Bimini, there's Mosul shoals. And what this is a reference to the shallow nature of the sea, the bottom of the sea beneath the surface. So once again, there are indications that this is where Plato suggests that his so-called Atlantic island, because that's what he first refers to it as, the Atlantic island. It's only in the second account, the Cretaeus, that he actually refers to it by name as Atlantis. Now, the other interesting point is this cataclysm. What's this? Well, he gives a date for this cataclysm, which is approximately 9600 BC. Of a long period of catastrophe and bad events going on in the world that had begun actually 1200 years earlier with what appears to have been a comet impact that completely devastated the North American continent and also affected the Atlantic itself. Almost certainly parts of this comet fell into the Atlantic Ocean and would have drowned areas of the Bahamas and the Caribbean on a temporary level with super tsunamis of the sort that we know today from Southeast Asia, Japan, things like this. Things which, to be honest, scientists didn't really properly understand until the 2000s. And so here we have more evidence of a cataclysm that is in the time frame that Plato actually gives for the destruction of Atlantis. Now, he doesn't give the start date of that cataclysm, but he certainly gives the end date of it, which is 9600 BC, because at that point the ice sheets, which had been temporarily re-advanced due to the ash and the debris and all the rest of it that had gone up into the air after this comet impact, eventually cleared, but not before the whole of the northern hemisphere had been covered with ice again, and this ice rapidly disappears around 9600 in what could have been even a second cosmic event around this time. So again, he seems to be absolutely accurate. But then the next question comes, is the rest of his account correct? And he talks about this massive Atlantis island empire with very advanced cities and channels and vessels and whatever. Is any of that real? And also, we must ask ourselves, well, where did he get this information from?
Well, and I think that's a very key question of where did he get this information from?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is put ourselves back in 350 BC. This was, what would it be, nearly 2,000 years before the discovery of the New World, the Americas, by Christopher Columbus and the various explorers that followed him. And the one thing that we know about these explorers is that, firstly, when they got to the Bahamas and the Caribbean, the indigenous peoples told the early chroniclers about this great cataclysm that had split apart the islands, particularly of the Bahamas, and left behind the hundreds of islands and keys that we have today. And what they said is that formerly all of these had been one landmass. Now, this information must have come from several thousand years earlier, because the reason why these islands split apart was not specifically but because the waters rose up at the end of the last ice age. After this mini ice age had disappeared, all of the so-called ice meltwater, in other words, the water that had been held within the ice, suddenly disappears. Sorry, not doesn't disappear. I mean, it suddenly melts and pours into the rivers. The rivers outpour it into the oceans, and this very gradually, over a period of a few thousand years, covers up the low-lying regions of not just the Bahamas and the Caribbean, but obviously other low-lying regions elsewhere in the world as well. So, in other words, let's say that the Bahamas and the Caribbeans were assaulted twice by water. Firstly, with these super tsunamis at the time of the initial impact event, and then much later the waters will come in again, but this time on a more permanent basis, caused by the rising of the sea levels. And of course the whole thing begins to get confused, even though what's so interesting is that some of the accounts actually talk about the waters coming in twice. And you've got to say to yourself, why is it that these people believed that the waters had come in twice and not once? And clearly they have this dim, almost abstract memory of firstly the tsunamis, and then much later the waters rising because of the end of the last ice age. So, as I say, several thousand years these stories must have been hanging around before they were told to the first Europeans to reach there in the end of the 15th century.
But, having two water coming in stories makes a lot of sense. I mean, to me, the gradual melting of the ice sheet and the rise of the water over 1,000 or 2,000 years does not equal catastrophe. It does not equal a flood. And, and so, you're left with this, that doesn't make any sense, but I've heard, I've done some research on like the Carolina Bay impact, and I guess there was another impact in the Oregon, Washington area, and then we have the death of all the megafauna that happened around the same time, and then the refreezing of the woolly mammoths and stuff, so that makes more sense. And I've actually never heard anybody put the timeline out that way.
Yeah. Well, all of what you've just mentioned there, everything from the Carolina Bays, which I go into in huge detail in the book, all of the evidence that we have relating to their age and what caused them, because this is a big controversy, a big debate, which is going on even to this day, because even when they were first discovered by aerial surveys in the 1920s, that one of the first solutions was that they were caused by meteors. And then a few other people came along and said, well, meteors wouldn't leave this type of crater behind. Perhaps it was fragments of a comet. And what's interesting, that this was the first time, really, that this idea became popular, that the Earth had suffered in recent geological history a massive impact event very recently. I mean, comparatively recently. I mean, we're only talking here the maximum of about 12 or 13,000 years ago, which, as I say, in geological times is yesterday, really. And you're talking about the disappearance of the megafauna. For instance, the mammoths, the saber-toothed tigers, giant sloths, giant camels, and all sorts of weird animals that roamed the continents at this time. Again, there's various theories as to what happened to them. I've covered this in various of my books, but extinction. I don't necessarily think it absolutely caused it 100%, because we know that mammoths survived, for instance, in some parts of Siberia, possibly as late as 3,000 to 4,000 BC. So it didn't absolutely destroy every single one of these creatures, but it didn't help their cause, as it were. And so all of this contributed to this great change that took place between around 11,000 BC down to about 9,600 BC. But even then, it wasn't over, because then the waters started covering up all the low-lying regions, some of it very, very quickly indeed. And here we possibly have explanations for the flood stories, which are found all over the world. Hundreds, if not thousands, of flood stories. Not only from North America, but from Britain, from the Java, Australia, all the way around the world. We have flood stories, and most of them probably relate to this time frame. And the bigger question that we have to ask is, how did Plato get all of this information? Well, the fact is that there is ample evidence to suggest that there was transoceanic voyages taking place before his day. And the main culprits for this were the Phoenicians. They were the people that had all the seaports in places like Lebanon and Syria and what is today Israel and the Palestinian territories, and also the Carthaginians. The Carthaginians were a sister colony of the Phoenicians, and their main city port was Carthage, which was on the coast of northwest Africa. The Phoenicians also had outposts in Spain and worked with local Iberian peoples. And after the Phoenicians began to wane in their power, the Spanish people behind these Phoenician colonies rose up and basically took over the same trading routes. And what's so interesting is that it was these same Iberian people that Christopher Columbus employed, or the descendants of them, for his own journeys. And they were telling him what he would find when they actually reached into the deep ocean. And this included this legendary island called Antillia, which I can show, and I do it in great detail in the book, is derived from exactly the same place name as Atlantis itself. They both were one and the same. And it was said that on this Antillia island were the 7 cities, the 7 lost cities. And this became a big thing to try and rediscover these 7 lost cities, which were supposedly, lined with gold. And the earliest European explorers tried to find them, in the wake of Columbus. When they didn't find them in the Bahamas, they didn't find them in Cuba or Hispaniola, they then went to the mainland and started to search in places like Venezuela, up the Orinoco River, and this turned into the search for El Dorado. This was the search for El Dorado, which never actually came to anything, because it was almost certainly just a myth, really. Of course, there are plenty of lost civilizations, but this idea of these 7 cities paved with gold, or with this king who was covered in gold all the time, was something that was quite clearly a myth that was born out of stories that were already thousands of years old, that had reached Spain, probably from the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians, who there's powerful evidence of them reaching the American mainland and the Bahamas. So this is how this information got into the world of Plato, into the Mediterranean world, because these stories were almost certainly carried there by sailors, seamen who were coming in from these long voyages, and they were probably told to keep absolutely quiet about what islands they were, reaching because of trade reasons, because the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians had very strict trade secrets about their journeys and where they would go. And almost certainly with cultures like of Mexico, probably by about 1000 BC, and they were bringing in produce into the Mediterranean world, which was finding its way into various places, including, for instance, the court of the pharaohs in Egypt, where we find evidence of tobacco and also cocaine and things like this within the mummies of the ancient Egyptians. Now, where did this come from? How could cocaine, which comes from the coca leaf, which is only found in South America, how could that possibly have reached Egypt? Clearly, there was some kind of trade. Now, exactly what routes were going on here, again, is something that I look at. It could have come across the Atlantic. There may have been other trading routes across the Pacific. It may well be that some of this produce was coming into places like China and then being shipped overland along the Silk Road into the Middle East, and then from there into Egypt. But it's real, it's there. And I think that we have to accept that Christopher Columbus was the last person to discover the Americas, not the first.
Well, he didn't discover it. The Native Americans were here first, so...
That's correct.
But I think that whole concept of trade, you would think that the things that they traded, they would try to grow and produce in Europe and not just bring the final product to Europe.
Absolutely. And I mean, tobacco is one example. Tobacco as an actual name was known even before Columbus's journey. And yet this was also the name that was used for what we now know as tobacco by the indigenous peoples of the Bahamas. So how is it that the peoples of Africa and the peoples of the Bahamas were both using the same name for the same thing? Because there was actually an indigenous form of tobacco in Africa, which is very little known. It's a slightly different species, and it's not properly used for smoking. It was certainly used as a herb. It was used as a remedy and things like this. There's no real evidence that it was actually smoked. However, it's exactly the same plant, or certainly the same genus. So how is this possible? And of course, the answer is that there was transoceanic contact between the peoples of West Africa and those of the Bahamas, and almost certainly the mainland of America, 1,000, maybe even 2,000 years before the time of Columbus. So this is how this exchange of ideas, and it's very possible that the peoples of Africa were importing in tobacco, and they realised that they had some themselves, or that they grew their own version of it that then created like a different strain that, although had the same genus as that from America, was now two separate species. So that's basically what the experts in this field believe.
Well, and would that explain why we find like the Olmec heads that have very Negroid features, because they were part of this transoceanic group that got recorded in a method? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, if you look at the art, both the carved statues and the reliefs at various of the Olmec centres, you will see a mixture of peoples from all over the world, not just from Africa. You'll see peoples from the Middle East with long pointed beards. You will see peoples from Fiji, from Southeast Asia. You'll see peoples from I would say from Africa, from Europe. I mean, clearly the Olmec was a very cosmopolitan civilization, and almost certainly was trading with peoples all over the world, both across the Atlantic and also across the Pacific, most obviously into China, Japan, and places like Vietnam.
Well, so if they were having all of this flooding, and I'm just kind of going over here a second, if they were having all this flooding and kind of like an annihilation event in the Americas 10,000 years ago, then who was left here? I mean, when we look at America, when Columbus showed up, we had the Native American culture that populated it. But to me, it seems like there was an older culture that even preceded what we find in the Native American culture. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, probably the earliest peoples coming into the Americas was probably around 50,000 BC. I mean, that's what the evidence suggests. I mean, they could easily have been here much earlier. And that this connection between the old world and the new world, if you like, probably continued on right the way through till the end of the last ice age, when finally, the ice firstly prevented too much contact across the Beringia land bridge between Siberia and, Alaska. And then finally, when that was drowned by the meltwaters from the last ice age, then that cut off contact. That was probably around 8,500 BC. But from about 50,000 through to that time, there was essentially means of contact. And I don't think it was just across the Beringia land bridge. Almost certainly there were peoples coming by boats from places like Java, via Australia, New Zealand, and possibly even the north coast of Antarctica. I say the north coast, of the coast between New Zealand and southwest South America. And the peoples were probably coming into South America and moving upwards, whereas obviously the archaeologists have it the other way. The peoples were always moving downwards. And amongst these people were those that had created high culture at various other parts of the world. I mean, for instance, in Java, we have a huge pyramid hill called Gunung Padang, of which there is evidence of activity there, possibly even a pyramid structure that goes back to 8,000 BC. And, the archaeologists suggest it could even be earlier. So who were these people and how far did they reach? Well, I mean, I've been to Java, and not only do the peoples there closely resemble some of the ethnic groups of people in places like Vietnam, for instance, and Japan and things like that, plus different aspects of culture. So in other words, there's this communication, but also that you look at a lot of the Javanese people, and you could be looking at there's the same people in Peru or Bolivia, people behind the huge civilizations of Tiwanaku, for instance. If you look at the statues, you could be looking at people from Java. And I think that almost certainly there was transoceanic, transpacific communication and contact between these different peoples at a very early age. But obviously we're going a little bit off track of Atlantis itself. But I think that the sum total of all of this, and all the subjects we're talking about here are essentially in the book, is that what we come down to is one fundamental answer, and that is that Plato could have received into his philosophical schools of debate information relating not just to the Bahamas and the Caribbean, but also the fact that they suffered a cataclysm several thousand years earlier, and that he's trying to raise interest in this subject by putting it in his book. It's in many ways it's almost an afterthought. certainly in the first book, the Timaeus, and I think that probably generated a lot of interest. So the second book that he talked about, the Cretaeus, is all about Atlantis, and he expands upon this subject immeasurably. And I think in some ways what he's done is he's used the core material that he originally had and has expanded it by almost inventing this huge civilization, and with cities that resemble those of his own Greek world. And this is one of the problems that we've got, is the misconceptions that people now have about Atlantis. They expect that if we find it underwater somewhere, you'll find Doric columns and beautiful temples that look like something out of Carthage or Athens or something like this. That's because we're seeing everything through the eyes of Plato. Most likely, we are going to be looking at prehistoric monuments that are very similar to the advanced structures that we find at places like Göbekli Tepe in southeast Turkey, and possibly, as I said, in Gunung Padang in Java, and various other early advanced monuments that are coming to light all the way around the world that go back to 8 to 9,000 BC.
That's Andrew Collins. His book is Atlantis in the Caribbean. His webpage, andrewcollins.com. And thank you for watching this portion of our interview with Andrew. If you're enjoying today's programming, please click on the button below and subscribe to our channel. If you want to hear the interview in its entirety, become a Just Energy Radio insider at justenergyradio.com and access full shows commercial-free and gain access to our over 9 years of show archives. And don't forget to share this episode with your friends on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So until next time, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy. Be blessed.